The road was nearly empty when I turned off the highway, and for a long stretch I drove beside a field of dead cornstalks clicking in the wind. One of them tapped against the side of my old pickup, a dry little knock. Nothing more, but the sound stayed with me sharp as a memory trying to return before you're ready for it. On the passenger seat, my mother's silver ring rolled with each dip in the asphalt. She'd mailed it to me last winter with 3 simple words: keep it close. I didn't understand then. Maybe I still don't. But watching that ring turn in the fading light, I felt something soon an unmistakable shift inside me. Like the past had stopped waiting politely and was now placing a quiet hand on my shoulder. I heard myself wonder barely above a breath. What was she trying to prepare me for, and why does it feel like the answer is somewhere just ahead of me? People expect warnings to come: loud storms, sirens, harsh words. Mine came as a soft, steady tapping from a ring on an empty seat, reminding me there are things I've avoided for years. Things that don't stay buried just because a man walks away. And as the road opened toward the town I once called home, I understood I wasn't just returning to a house full of memories. I was driving toward whatever my mother left for me: a truth, a choice, and maybe a chance to rewrite the life I'd nearly let slip away. I reached Cedar Point just as the last line of daylight slipped behind the trees. The air held that early evening stillness I always remembered from childhood, the kind that feels less like quiet and more like something suspended in time. I turned off the engine and listened to the gravel settle under the tires. Grief has a way of sharpening sound, and every small noise felt louder than it should. My mother's final letter was folded inside my jacket. I kept touching it without meaning to. There are things you must understand before it is too late. The words carried a tone I could not place, somewhere between warning and forgiveness. Leaving the cemetery that morning, I had the sense that her story was not finished, that she had left a door cracked open for me to walk through. I just did not know what waited on the other side. The house looked the same as it always had. Weathered boards faded by Midwest winter's porch swing hanging by the chain I replaced years ago. But the moment I walked up the steps, I felt something was wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, not enough to signal danger, but just enough to feel deliberate. I hesitated, then pushed it open. A draft moved through the hallway carrying a faint scent of fresh coffee. On the kitchen table sat a mug that was still warm when I wrapped my hands around it. Nothing was broken, nothing touched. In towns like this, people still let themselves into each other's homes, though rarely without leaving a note. I stood there a moment, listening for footsteps or breathing, and told myself not to imagine more than what was in front of me. I walked through the rooms slowly. My mother's humming seemed to echo in corners where no sound lived anymore. Her belongings remained arranged with the quiet precision she favored. I passed the small window where she used to call me when I stayed away too long. I remembered the last text she sent me this winter, short and simple, asking if I was eating well. I had read it while preparing a work report that felt urgent at the time. I told myself I would reply later. Later never came. That memory sat in my chest like a stone I could not lift. Outside the bedroom door, I stopped again, unable to decide if stepping inside would make her absence heavier or lighter. The room smelled of lavender and old wood. I sat on the bed and let my eyes adjust to the fading light. A slight unevenness under the frame caught my attention. I reached beneath and pulled out a small wooden box rubbed smooth from being opened and closed many times. My name was written on the lid in her familiar handwriting. Inside were folded land surveys, legal notes, and a photograph that made something shift in me. My mother stood in the orchard during late autumn, her hair tucked behind her ear. Her expression soft in a way I had not seen in years. Beside her was a man I did not recognize. They stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and there was a calmness between them that hinted at history. I turned the photo over but found no date, no name, no explanation. While I held the picture, Ann Calder appeared at the doorway. She kept her voice low when she said she was checking on me. She stepped into the room and looked around with the kind of tenderness people reserve for homes that hold more stories than residents. She told me she had once seen my mother arguing with a man on the porch a few weeks before she passed. She said the man reminded her of my father, not exactly, but enough in the way he moved, the way he stood. The sun had been low, she added, and she might have been mistaken, but the memory unsettled her. I thanked her, though I was not sure what to make of it. After she left, her words lingered like a draft slipping under the door. I returned to the box and unfolded the letter I had already read earlier that day. Her handwriting trembled slightly in places as if she had paused often while writing. The truth lives in this house, Jack, and now it belongs to you. Reading it again in her empty room, the line felt heavier, as though she had known I would resist coming back, as though she understood the way I had been drifting through my own life without anchoring anywhere. I closed the letter and sat with the box beside me. The house was quiet but not empty. It held too much of her, too much of the things unsaid between us. I noticed then that a small ceramic bird she kept on the dresser was not where it had always been. She never moved that thing. It had stood by the mirror for as long as I could remember. Now it rested on the windowsill as if someone had placed it there while looking outside. That small detail tightened something inside me. It was the kind of change only someone who knew this house intimately would make. Someone who had not meant to leave a trace but had. I felt the first stirrings of something I had not felt in a long time. Not fear, not exactly. More like the quiet recognition that life was nudging me toward a story I had avoided. The orchard. The unknown man. My mother's altered possessions. The warmth of the coffee mug. Her final letter whispering through the silence. I stayed on the bed until the sky outside turned completely dark. The longer I sat there, the more certain I became that my mother had not only left me her home. She had handed me the beginning of a truth she could not carry alone. When I finally stood, the floorboards gave a soft groan beneath my feet. It felt like the house acknowledging me, or warning me. I could not tell which. What I did know was simple. I had crossed back into this place as a son saying goodbye. But as the night settled in, I understood I would not be leaving as the same man. Morning came softly, the kind of pale light that slips between curtains like it is asking permission to enter. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle over me. The night before had left a weight in the house, one that had not lifted with sleep. It felt as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to move. When I finally stood, the floorboard beneath my heel gave a low creak, a small reminder that nothing here would let me pass unnoticed. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee, not because I needed it, but because the familiar sound steadied the air. The mug I had washed last night was cool now, and I ran my fingers over it, remembering the warmth still lingering on it when I arrived. I tried not to read too much into that, but the thought stayed with me like a faint pressure at the back of my mind. Someone had been here, not by accident and not casually. I began cleaning not out of duty but out of instinct. My mother had kept this house as if every object mattered. Touching her things was a way of learning what she tried to say without saying it. I moved from shelf to shelf, brushing dust from the edges of framed photos, straightening stacks of books she must have read and reread in the evenings. Behind one of them, I found a birthday card I had sent her years ago, tucked away like a keepsake. She had written inside it in her small, neat hand, "I miss you more than I say. Come home when you can." I closed the card slowly. I wondered how long she had waited for a message that never came. When I reached the back of the house, I stopped. The window above the laundry sink was open in a way that was too careful to be accidental. The glass pane had been lifted out and leaned against the wall. There were no shards, no scratches, no marks on the frame. Someone had taken their time. That meant they either knew my mother well or they came prepared. Neither thought settled comfortably in me. I felt a faint shiver run along my spine, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that someone else was following the same trail I had only just begun. Nothing was missing, nothing disturbed. Whoever entered had treated the house almost respectfully, as though searching for something they believed to be rightfully theirs. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I knew how it would sound. No break-in, no theft, just a window someone opened with more care than mischief. In a place like Cedar Point, the law waited for facts, not instincts. I returned to the living room and opened the wooden box again. The surveys lay inside the paper, thinning at the folds. I spread them across the table and traced the lines with my finger, following boundaries that stretched further than they should have. The borders reached past the fence I had known my whole life, past the slope where the grass changed color in autumn, and straight toward the orchard. It was either a mistake from decades ago or a deliberate alteration by someone who understood the value of land more than a family ever could. The orchard drew me outside. The morning light had risen enough to touch the tips of the branches, giving them a silver sheen. I walked toward it slowly, feeling the wetness of the grass chill my shoes. My mother had worn a path through this yard, a narrow line pressed into the soil. She must have walked it hundreds of times. Anne once said my mother would stand here and whisper something into the wind. One day it will come back. I could almost see her there now, her shoulders slightly bent, her gaze fixed on the abandoned trees as if waiting for them to breathe again. I stood at the edge of the orchard for a while. The branches were twisted and bare, but there was something watchful in them. It felt as though the place remembered me, even if I had long forgotten it. Then I turned back inside before the quiet could swallow me whole. On the kitchen table, I sorted through the envelopes. Bills past due, notices from lawyers, and one name appearing again and again: Westbrook Holdings. I had heard the name whispered in town for years. A company that seemed to grow like a shadow, absorbing land and pushing out families 1 acre at a time. Seeing their names stamped on my mother's letters brought a heaviness to my chest. She had been fighting a battle she chose not to share with me. Maybe she thought she could handle it alone. Maybe she didn't want to trouble me. Or maybe she knew I was already drifting too far to help. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a smaller envelope with my name on it. Inside was a key, old and worn, heavy enough to feel meaningful. I tried it on every door in the house, even the shed out back, but it matched nothing. It was meant for something else, something she wanted me to find. When I slipped it into my pocket, I felt a quiet resolve settle in me. I did not know when the key opened, but I knew she trusted me to figure it out. I packed the papers and the key back into the wooden box. As I closed the lid, I noticed a faint smear of dirt on the corner. It had not been there last night. I ran my thumb over it once slowly. Someone else had opened this box before me. Not recently, perhaps, but not long enough ago for the dust to settle again. The air changed as I walked to the back door. A shift of light, a small tension gathering. I paused with my hand on the frame and looked toward the orchard. A slight indentation marked the grass near the fence, the shape of a boot print softened by the morning dew. It pointed toward the trees, not away from them. For a moment I stood completely still, listening for anything that might tell me I was not alone. Only the leaves moved, stirring softly in the breeze, but the air held a quiet urgency, as if the past had begun waking one piece at a time. I stepped outside just far enough for the light to reach my face. The orchard waited in its stillness. The house breathed behind me, and I felt in a way I had not understood before that my mother had left me more than a home. She had left a trail, and the trail had already begun to move. The next step on that trail led me into town. By late morning, the sky over Cedar Point had turned a flat, pale gray, the kind that makes colors look tired. I drove past the diner, the feed store, the hardware shop with its faded sign, all of it familiar and distant at the same time. My mother used to wave at half the people on this street. I stayed behind the wheel, one hand on the steering wheel, the other in my jacket pocket, feeling the worn edge of the key she had left me. The law office sat in a narrow brick building near the courthouse. A single brass plaque by the door read Harris and Cole Attorneys at Law. Inside it smelled like old carpet and copier toner, and somewhere underneath that coffee that had been on the warmer too long. A woman at the front desk asked my name, then disappeared down the hall. When she called me back, I stepped into a small office with shelves bowing under the weight of binders. Daniel Harris stood up from behind his desk, sleeves rolled to his forearms, gray showing at his temple. He had the look of a man who had seen every kind of small-town trouble and knew exactly how much of it could be fixed with paper. He said he was sorry about Margaret. He called her by her first name, and it carried a gentle familiarity that told me she had spent time in this room. I nodded, thanked him, and waited. He opened a folder with my mother's name on it, then looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "She did not tell you about any of this?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." He sighed, then tapped the papers inside the file. "Westbrook Holdings has been circling this property for a long time. They started with letters, offers, gentle pressure. When she refused to sell, they moved to something more aggressive." He slid one of the documents toward me. I read the heading slowly. "Motion for preliminary order of sale in the event of heir refusal." There was my mother's name. There was the description of the land, and beneath it a line about forcing a sale through the court if necessary. I felt my jaw tighten. She had never mentioned any of this, not once. All those evenings on the phone when she asked about my day, my job, my health, and not a word about the company trying to pry this house out from under her. "How far did they get?" I asked. He leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach. "Not as far as they wanted. We responded, challenged their standing, argued that any forced sale was premature while she was alive and competent. But it was meant to scare her, Jack, to wear her down. They filed the motion to show they could." He flipped another page. "There is something else. A few months before she passed, I received a call. A man claimed to be a co-heir to the property, asked about his rights, wanted to know what would happen when Margaret was gone. The word landed in my chest like a stone. Co-heir. My mother had one child, me. "Did he give a name?" I asked. Harris shook his head. "No," he refused, said he would call back. He never did. Caller ID was blocked. It happened once, then nothing. Your mother did not seem surprised when I told her, just tired. She asked me to let it go. I sat with that for a moment. The idea that someone else might think they had a claim to this land, to this house, to her. The room felt smaller. I pressed my palms against my thighs until the tension in them steadied me. I asked about Westbrook. Harris slid another stack of papers toward me, letters on company letterhead. All of them smooth and polite and sharp at the edges. They offered market value and then some. They spoke of opportunity, progress, community benefit. Between the lines, I could see the same thing I had seen in other contracts in other lives. Pressure disguised as generosity. "And their attorney," I said. "Who did most of the talking?" Harris flipped to a correspondence log. "The lead counsel on most of these," he said, "was a man named Victor Hale. He came up from Columbus, big city type, very sure of himself." The name sat in my mind without finding a place to hook itself. It felt familiar and not. Harris said a few more things about possible responses about what options I had now. But my attention had begun to drift. The air in the office felt close. On his desk, the edge of the old orchard photo peeked out of the folder I had brought. He gestured toward it. "May I?" he asked. I nodded, and he lifted the photograph gently, giving it a quick look before handing it back. "That tree must have been beautiful once," he said. "Your mother loved that orchard. She mentioned it every time we talked." I held the photo a little closer as I stood to leave. The man beside my mother in the picture watched me with a steady gaze, as if he wanted to say something across the years. The slope of his shoulders, the line of his jaw, the way his mouth curved when he half smiled. Something stirred in my memory, not a specific person, but an impression. I slid the photo into my pocket and thanked Harris again. Outside Main Street moved at its usual pace. A couple of teenagers crossed in front of my car, hands in the pockets of their hoodies. An older man loaded bags of feed into the back of his pickup. The ordinary rhythm of a town that did not know or did not care that a few miles away a woman had been fighting a quiet war over the land beneath her feet. Back at the house, I set the folder on the table and pulled out the photograph again. I placed it beside the letters from Westbrook next to a printed email signature bearing the name Victor Hale Senior Counsel. I stared at the photo until the man's features blurred, then resolved again. Younger, leaner around the face, but the same eyes, the same faint tilt of the head. Time can change a person, but not that much. I felt the realization rise slowly. The man standing in my mother's orchard all those years ago was the same man who now led the effort to take it from her. I leaned back and let that settle. Harris had said there was another name on the old title before my parents. I went back to the surveys, tracing the lines of faded ink until I found it. Henry Marston. The letters were almost worn away, but still there. I ran my thumb over them as if touch alone could conjure a memory. My mind offered nothing clear, only a vague impression of hearing that name once in a conversation that stopped when I walked into the room. It would have been easy in that moment to pretend it did not matter. That whatever history lay between my mother and this Marston, and between her and the man who now called himself Victor Hale, had nothing to do with me. I tried to tell myself that for a few seconds. Then another face rose uninvited in my mind. Caleb, 17 years old now. The last time I had seen him, he was standing on the front lawn of the house in Columbus where his mother lived, hands shoved into his jacket, eyes avoiding mine. I had promised to call more, to show up more. I had meant it at the time. Then work had bled into every corner of my life, and shame had done the rest. The silence between us grew the way these property lines had slowly and then all at once. I thought of him now, and it hurt in a way that felt familiar and fresh at the same time. The idea of some unknown man calling himself a co-heir to my mother's land tapped against something raw in me. I had a son who might one day feel like a stranger to his own family, to his own name, because of my absence. There were more inheritances than the ones written into wills. My phone buzzed on the table. For a moment I thought it might be Sarah or Caleb, as if thinking of them had pulled one of them toward me. The screen showed an unknown number. No name, just 10 digits I had never seen. I opened the message. "Stop digging. The past is not yours to unearth." I stared at the words until they lost shape, and then found it again. Someone knew exactly what I was doing. Someone wanted me to stop. The edges of the room felt closer for a moment. I loosened my grip on the phone before I cracked it in my hand. There was no second message, no threat, no explanation. Just that one line sitting on the screen like a small, sharp stone. I set the phone down beside the photograph and the surveys. Outside, the afternoon light had thinned, slipping through the bare branches of the trees in long, narrow bands. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with all the things I had not wanted to face, my mother's loneliness. Whoever Henry Marston had been to her, the man in the orchard who had grown into the attorney now trying to erase our claim, the son I had allowed to drift to the edge of my life. Every line I traced on those maps, every name I uncovered tugged on another loose thread inside me. I could feel them pulling tighter together, past and present, land and blood. I stood at the window and watched the wind move through the orchard, barely enough to stir the branches, just enough to shift the light. My phone screen dimmed and went dark, but the words stayed with me. Stop digging. I curled my fingers against the glass of the window, feeling the faint chill seeping through, and understood that whoever sent that message did not know me very well. I had been running from difficult things my whole life, this time standing in my mother's house with her secrets spread out in front of me. I felt something different. I was done running. The branches outside swayed once more, slow and thin against the gray sky, then settled back into stillness. The call came as the light was starting to thin. That late afternoon gray that makes the orchard look like a sketch instead of something real. I had been standing at the kitchen sink, my hands resting on the rim, staring through the window without really seeing anything, when my phone began to buzz on the table behind me. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. We had not spoken in weeks, maybe months if I was honest. We were down to practical messages now, schedules and paperwork, never anything that hurt. I hesitated for a breath, then answered. Her voice came through tight and too fast. She said Caleb was gone. She had come home from a shift at the hospital and his room was empty. Clothes missing, backpack gone, phone left on the bed like a small accusation. She said she had called the kids he spent time with, checked the places he liked to go, nothing. Then she asked if I had heard from him. I had not. I listened to the sound of her breathing, the rough edges in it. She was angry under the fear, not at him, not fully, but at the way everything seemed to come apart, no matter how hard she tried to hold it together. I knew that feeling. I had given it to her. If he shows up there, she said, tell me. Please, I told her I would. It was the only promise I could make. We hung up and the house swallowed the quiet again. I stayed there, watching the orchard darken by degrees. I tried to picture where Caleb might go, how far a 17-year-old boy could get on a bus pass and stubbornness. My chest tightened at the thought that there were corners of his life I no longer knew well enough to imagine. By the time the knock came on the front door, the sun had slipped low, turning the last light into a pale wash across the living room floor. I knew it was him before I opened the door. Some part of me had been waiting for it since I left Columbus years ago, waiting for the moment my past would walk right up to me and ask why I let it go. He stood on the porch with his hoodie up and his backpack slung over one shoulder, taller than the last time I had seen him, leaner in the face. His eyes met mine, flat and tired, the kind of tired that does not come from lack of sleep. "Hey," he said. I stepped back to let him in. He moved past me, looking around without letting it show too much, taking in the house. The photos on the wall, the weight of a life he had heard about but never really seen. I closed the door and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence between us was not new, it had just found a new room to live in. He dropped his backpack by the couch. "Mom called you," he said. "Yes, she's freaking out." I nodded. "I know." He gave a short laugh that held no humor. "You always know. You just do not do anything." The words landed harder than I wanted them to. Still, they were not wrong. I nodded again because arguing with the truth has never changed it. "Come into the kitchen," I said. "We can talk." We sat at the table where my mother had once sat alone with her unpaid bills and unanswered letters. I poured him a glass of water. His hands were restless on the table, fingers tapping a rhythm only he understood. "Why are you here?" I asked. Not as an accusation, just a fact I needed to hear from his mouth. He stared at the glass, then at the window, then finally at me. "Why did you disappear from my life while you were still breathing?" he said. There it was, clean, sharp, no place for me to hide. I could have told him about the long hours and the layoffs and the way shame makes you believe your absence is a favor to everyone else. I could have mentioned the nights I sat in my apartment with the phone in my hand. His number on the screen and my thumb hovering above the call button that never moved. None of that sounded like enough. "I messed up," I said. "I backed away when things went bad. I thought I was protecting you from watching me fall apart. I was wrong." He looked at me like he was weighing the words. "You did not just back away," he said. "You vanished. Birthdays, games, the day I got my license. Even when you were still in Columbus, you were not really there. You just faded out. Every example was a nail. I felt each one go in." "You are right," I said quietly. He blinked, surprised for a moment by the lack of defense. He had come in ready for a fight, and I had given him no foothold for it. He shifted in his chair. "Something weird happened a few months ago," he said. "I did not know if I should tell Mom. I sure as hell did not want to tell you. But I guess we are here now." He rubbed his palms on his jeans. "This guy called, blocked number, said he knew my family, said your mom, Grandma Margaret, was going to leave this house to someone more deserving, someone who actually cared. He said you had dropped the ball years ago and she knew it." He kind of laughed when he said it. The room felt smaller again. I felt the same cold tightening I had felt reading the message on my phone about digging into the past. "What did you say?" I asked. "I told him to screw off," Caleb said. Then I hung up. But it stuck. I started thinking maybe you and Grandma had some whole other life you never thought I needed to know about. His gaze flicked to the wooden box on the table, to the spread of papers I had failed to gather up before he arrived. "Looks like I was not wrong," he added. I followed his eyes, then looked back at him. "There is a lot I did not tell you," I said. "Some of it because I was a coward. Some of it because I did not know it myself until a few days ago." He watched me waiting. I opened the box and took out one of the land surveys, then the old orchard photo. I did not dump everything on him. I just let him see that the secrets in this house were real, not stories invented by strangers on blocked numbers. "I found something else earlier," I said. "In my mom's room." I reached for the journal fragment I had slipped into the back of the box. The pages were fragile, torn from a larger notebook. I laid it between us. The ink had faded in places, but one line was still clear enough to read. "Perhaps Caleb will mend what Jack could not." He leaned forward, reading it twice, then a third time. She wrote that he said, "Yes." He sat back. The fight in his shoulders eased a fraction, replaced by something more complicated. "So she believed in me more than she believed in you," he said. There was a flicker of challenge in it, but under that I heard uncertainty, even a hint of pride he did not want to show. "Maybe she just knew we would both need help," I said. The air between us shifted, not warm, not yet, but less freezing than it had been when he walked through the door. My phone buzzed again on the table, cutting through whatever was forming there. This time the number had a name attached, Westbrook Holdings. I did not want him to see the way my hand tightened, but his eyes were sharper than that. "You going to get that?" he asked. I answered, put it on speaker, set it down between us. A man on the other end introduced himself in that careful, polished way people do when they have said the same thing 100 times. He explained he represented Westbrook, that they were prepared to escalate the matter regarding the property. He used words like timeline and options and legal remedies. Underneath it all was the simple message: we will not go away. I kept my voice level, asked for everything in writing, told him I would respond after consulting counsel. The conversation lasted no more than a few minutes, but it felt longer with Caleb sitting there listening to every word. When it ended, the kitchen was quiet again. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Caleb looked at me differently now. Less like I was the man who had chosen not to show up, more like someone trying to hold up a weight alone. "So that is what you have been doing here," he said. "Fighting a company with more money than God in a house that probably should have fallen over 10 years ago, something like that," I said. He exhaled a short breath that left his shoulders lower than before. "I thought you were just hiding," he said. "From me, from everything. But you are not. You are just outnumbered." He let the words hang there, then added softer, "I am not letting you face this alone anymore." I watched him, the stubborn line of his jaw I recognized as my own, the hurt in his eyes mingling with something else now, something that looked a lot like resolve. For the first time in a long time, I felt the outline of a bridge between us, not sturdy yet, but real. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much more without breaking whatever fragile thing had started to form there. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the orchard. The branches turned to dark lines against a deepening sky. Inside, the kitchen felt less empty. The house, which had been holding its breath for days, seemed to ease just slightly, as if acknowledging a new presence. Caleb reached for the old photograph on the table, turning it toward the light. I watched his fingers trace the edge of my mother's image, then the stranger beside her. There was still so much I did not know. About her, about this land, about the man in the picture and the one now sending letters from a city office. But for the first time, I was not standing in that uncertainty by myself. Morning came with a thin white light and a sky that could not decide if it wanted to clear or close. Caleb slept on the old couch in the living room, one arm over his face, his backpack shoved beneath his head. I watched him for a moment from the doorway, the rise and fall of his chest steady the boy and the man in him taking turns in the set of his jaw. I made coffee and let the smell move through the house. The familiar sound of the machine was almost enough to make this feel like any other morning, except it was not. The file from Harris sat on the table. The photograph lay beside it, Margaret and the stranger in the orchard, their faces turned toward the camera as if they knew someone would need to see them much later. I was still staring at that picture when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. The sound was wrong for this hour, not Anne, not the male, heavier, slower, deliberate. Caleb stirred on the couch as the car door shut. I moved to the window and saw a dark sedan in the drive, polished in a way that did not belong on this road. A man stepped out, straightening his jacket, looking at the house like he was already assessing its value. He came up the walkway and rapped on the door with the back of his knuckles. 3 firm knocks, no hesitation. I opened the door. The man on the porch looked to be in his late 50s. His hair, more silver than black, was combed back with care. Clean lines in the face, the kind carved by years of decision and little doubt. He held a leather folder in one hand, and what might have once been an easy smile in reserve. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. His voice carried the city with it. Not New York or Los Angeles, just that practiced calm you hear in corporate conference rooms and depositions. I nodded. "You are from Westbrook." He inclined his head slightly. "Victor Hale," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." I did not invite him to sit. He stepped inside anyway, slow enough to seem polite, sure enough to make it clear he assumed this would go his way. His eyes moved over the entry, the framed photographs, the worn floorboards. They rested for a second on Caleb, now sitting up on the couch, then came back to me. "Lovely place," Hale said. "Your mother took pride in it." He said it like a man reading lines he had practiced. Caleb stood, shoulders squared. "Can I help you?" he asked. Hale studied him. "You must be Caleb," he said. "Your father and I have some business to discuss." Caleb looked at me. I gave him a small nod, one that said I had this at least for now. We went into the kitchen. I stayed standing. So did he. The folder went on the table with a soft thud. "I will get to the point," he said. "Westbrook has been in contact with your family about this property for some time. Your mother resisted, which is her right. Now that the estate is moving forward, my client would like to resolve the matter quickly. We are prepared to offer a generous figure." He slid a document toward me. At the bottom was a number that would have made sense in most lives I had lived. Enough to clear debts, start fresh somewhere else. Enough to walk away. Caleb leaned in, reading it over my shoulder. "You want to tear this place down?" he said. Hale kept his gaze on me. "We want to develop it," he replied. "Housing, retail jobs. Progress is not a bad word, despite what small towns sometimes think." His eyes were steady. They reminded me of the man in the photograph outside the orchard, younger, but with the same studied confidence. I reached for the folder, not to sign anything, but to see what else he had brought. Before I opened it, I looked directly at him. "You knew my mother," I said. It was not a question. I let the words sit there, quiet and certain. Something flickered in his expression, small and quick, but there. "We spoke," he said, professionally. I picked up the photograph from the table, turned it so he could see Margaret under the old apple tree. The man beside her, his features echoing the ones in front of me now. I held the picture where the light hit it. "This is you," I said. He studied it a beat longer than he needed to, then lifted his eyes to mine. "Some stories are meant to stay buried with the people who lived them," he said. His tone did not change, but there was a tightness at the edges, like a man pressing a lid down on something that wanted to I let the photo drop back to the table, careful not to let my hand shake. Caleb watched us, both, eyes moving from the picture to Hale to me, trying to assemble the pieces we barely understood. Hale opened his folder again. "Regardless of personal history," he said, "the legal situation is straightforward. Westbrook holds an interest, the county records support our position, and we are prepared to pursue a forced sale if necessary." He pulled out a fresh map, clean and precise property lines in neat ink. It showed the house and a tight ring of land around it. The orchard, the lower field, the far edge by the creek, all shaded as if they did not belong to us at all. "This is the current boundary," he said. "The county recognizes this limitation. Your mother's older documents, while interesting, do not match what is on file." I thought of the surveys in my mother's box of Henry Marston's name nearly rubbed away, of Harris showing me the older lines. I thought of my mother's tired eyes, the way she had probably sat in this very chair listening to a younger version of this speech. For much of my life, this is where I would have backed away, accepted what was in front of me, told myself, you cannot fight what is too big to see the edges of. But something had shifted when Caleb walked through my door. Something shifted again when he said he would not let me face this alone. I pushed the map back toward Hale. "I am not selling," I said. His eyes narrowed the smallest degree. "You understand the consequences of refusal?" he asked. I did not look away. "You understand this land has a longer memory than your records," I said, "and so do I." For a moment no one moved. Then he gathered the papers, sliding them back into the folder with deliberate care. "Very well," he said. "We will proceed accordingly." He walked to the door. At the threshold he paused and glanced back at the photograph still on the table, at my mother's younger face, at his own beside her. She deserved a simpler life than the one she got, he said quietly. Then he was gone, and the sound of his car receded down the gravel drive until it was nothing but another small noise swallowed by the day. Caleb let out a breath he had been holding. "He is the guy in the picture," he said. "Yes, And he is trying to take the land she fought to keep. Yes. Caleb shook his head, a short, disbelieving motion. That is messed up, he said. I could not argue. We spent the afternoon at the table with my mother's box. Among the papers was a page torn from one of her notebooks, a rough sketch of the property. Not like the formal survey. This one was done by her hand. She had outlined the house, the yard, the orchard, the lower fields. She had drawn an X near the oldest apple tree, the one that had been there longer than anything else in the yard. She had written beside it only one word: begin. Caleb traced the lines with his finger. You think she meant to hide something there? He asked. I think she meant for us to look, I said. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows by the time we stepped outside with shovels from the shed. The air carried that cool edge that comes just before evening sets in for good. The oldest apple tree stood at the far end of the orchard, its trunk twisted, branches bare like fingers reaching for something just out of reach. We walked in silence, stopping at the base where the roots pushed up through the soil in thick ridges. I knelt and pressed my hand against the ground, feeling for any raised patch, any unnatural firmness. Caleb watched, then started digging beside me, the two of us working in a rhythm that did not need words. The earth resisted at first, compacted by years of rain and neglect. Then a foot or so down the sound changed. The shovel hit something that rang dull and solid. Caleb glanced at me, eyes brightening a little. There it is, he said. We cleared the dirt away with our hands until the outline of a small box emerged, metal corroded and rough corners rounded by time. Rust flaked off when I touched it. It was heavier than it looked when we lifted it free. We carried it to a spot where the ground was dry and sat down under the skeleton of the tree. The sun was almost gone now, the sky shifting to that deep blue that arrives just before night. We did not open the box right away. It lay between us, silent, as if it needed a moment to remember why it had been waiting. Caleb leaned back against the trunk, looking out over the orchard at the broken branches, the dead grass, the empty space where fruit used to hang. It looks like us, he said finally. Left alone too long, but not beyond fixing. The words hung in the cool air. Simple, but they found their way into me and settled there. I looked at him, at the dirt on his hands, at the set of his shoulders, at the boy who had come here angry and was now sitting beside me under a tree that had seen more than both of us. For a long moment we just sat there, breathing in the quiet. The box waited at our feet, 3 generations worth of choices sealed inside. I did not know yet what it held or what opening it would change, but something had already shifted. I felt it in the way the house no longer seemed to stand alone on the hill, in the way the land beneath us felt less like a burden and more like a story we were finally ready to hear. Somewhere beyond the trees a dog barked, once sharp and distant, then stopped. A light came on in the kitchen window, a soft square glowing against the dark. I rested my hand on the lid of the box, not to open it, not yet, just to feel the rough metal under my palm. For the first time in a very long time I could sense the outline of something that did not feel like loss. It felt like the start of a rebuild. We sat there a long time under the old apple tree. The metal box between us, the sky sinking from blue to something closer to ink. Crickets started up along the fence line, and the air cooled enough that I could see my breath in little wisps when I exhaled. The house windows glowed behind us, small squares of yellow in the dark. At some point I realized waiting would not change what was inside. I nodded toward the box. You ready? I asked. Caleb pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them, then lowered his chin in a slow nod. Yeah, he said. Open it. The latch fought me, rust, grinding against itself, but it gave way with a rough snap. The lid lifted on stiff hinges. A smell rose up from inside, a mix of paper and metal and earth, the scent of things kept away from light for too long. Bundles of letters lay on top, tied with a strip of faded cloth. Beneath them, something thicker wrapped in waxed paper. The edges of a folded map peered out from under that. I lifted the first bundle. The top envelope had my mother's name written in a hand that was unfamiliar to me, firm and straight. Margaret. No last name, no address, just her name and a date from a year before I was born. We carried the box back to the house, needing the light more than we needed the comfort of the tree. At the kitchen table, I spread the contents out carefully, afraid too much force might turn them to dust. The first letter began simply. He wrote that he had arrived in Cedar Point after years away, that the land felt different, yet somehow the same, that he had never stopped thinking about the orchard. His name appeared at the bottom. Henry Marston. He wrote of the trees of the creek at the far edge of the property, of how they had once walked the lines of the field, talking about futures neither of them believed they deserved. He apologized for the past without describing it in full, as if both of them already knew the shape of it. He mentioned the man she had married, my father, and said he hoped the man treated her better than he had. I read in silence while Caleb watched my face. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I was not sure how to answer, so I nodded once and kept reading. In another letter, he spoke of a decision. He had no children. He wrote no one who would want the land when he was gone. He said the property had always felt more like hers than his. He was arranging to transfer the deed to sign it over to her while he still could. He did not know what her husband would think, but he believed it was the right thing to do. I reached for the waxed paper. Inside was an official-looking document, the ink faded but legible. A deed transferring ownership from Henry Marston to Margaret Whitmore. Dated 1979. Witnessed. Stamped. Legal. Beneath that lay the folded survey. I opened it carefully. The lines matched the ones I had seen in my mother's box, not the narrow version Hale had dropped on our table. The boundaries stretched across the orchard all the way to the creek, the land breathing wide on the page. At the bottom hung a surveyor signature and a date that matched the deed. In the margin, written in a tight, familiar script, were 3 words: "He has seen this." It was my father's handwriting. I sat back. The room went a little softer around the edges. My father had known. He had stood where I was standing now, or sat at this same table holding the same map. He had seen the lines drawn by another man and the land given to his wife, land that came with history he was not a part of, and he had chosen not to speak of it. I tried to imagine that moment, him reading Henry's words about regret and love, and land my mother standing somewhere nearby, maybe watching him, maybe pretending not to. Whatever passed between them, it left its mark in the way he lived the rest of his life. Quiet, contained, present, but guarded. I thought about the times I had waited for him to explain why we did not talk about certain things, why his eyes sometimes grew distant when my mother was in the orchard. He never did. He swallowed it all and taught me without meaning to that hard truths were something you kept inside until they turned to stone. I looked up and saw Caleb watching me. He had picked up one of the letters and was reading it, his brow furrowing as he traced the sentences. He knew, Caleb said. "My father," I said. "Yeah." He knew. Caleb set the letter down, his voice lower. "You do this too," he said. "Keep stuff inside. Pretend if you do not say it, it cannot hurt anyone." The words were not cruel, they were just accurate. "Maybe I learned that from him," I said. "Maybe you do not have to keep it," he replied. We went through more letters. Some were brief updates. Some were longer, written in a drifting hand that grew shakier in the later years. Henry wrote about illness, about feeling time thinning around him, about wanting to put things in order before he was gone. He never stopped referring to the land as something alive. He wanted it in the hands of someone who knew what it meant, not just what it was worth. Near the bottom of the stack was a letter written by my mother. She thanked him not just for the deed, but for trusting her with something he loved. She wrote that she hoped one day her son would understand why that mattered. I had to stop reading for a moment. My throat felt tight. Caleb put his hand around his glass of water and kept still, as if any movement would break something in the air between us. My phone buzzed on the table, the sound jarring in the quiet. An email notification. Unknown sender, a long string of letters and numbers in place of a name. For a second I thought it might be another message telling me to stop digging. I opened it and scanned the first lines. The words were clipped and careful. I work for Westbrook. I cannot sign my name. What they are doing with your land, they have done before. Attached are internal documents. Use them if you can. Do not reply. There were 3 attachments. The first showed an internal memo discussing modifications to survey lines on multiple properties in the county. The second contained a chain of emails, Hale among the recipients, gently directing a contracted surveyor to adjust boundaries for clarity, which was another way of saying to shrink the parcels before offer. The third was a list of parcels where similar changes had been made. My chest tightened again, but this time the feeling was different. Less helpless, more like anger finding form. Caleb leaned closer. What is it? He asked. Proof, I said. Someone on the inside thinks this has gone too far. He nodded once slowly. So it is not just us, he said. No, I said, it is not just us. We spent the rest of the evening sorting the documents into rough piles. Letters from Henry, letters from my mother, legal papers, surveys, internal emails that, taken together, painted a picture of a company that believed no one would look closely at the way lines quietly shifted on a map. By the time we were done, the night had settled hard outside. The orchard was nothing but a darker patch against the sky. I closed the curtains and locked the doors, not because I thought it would deter anyone truly determined, but because small acts of caution were all we had right then. Sleep came late. When it did, it was thin and restless. I woke once in the dark, certain I had heard something outside, a low crack like wood under strain. I told myself it was the old house adjusting to the temperature drop and forced my eyes closed again. Morning proved me wrong. The sun had barely cleared the trees when Caleb came into the kitchen. Hair tousled, socks damp from the grass. You should see this, he said. His voice was tight. We walked out together. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth. At first I thought the orchard simply looked as it always had, bare and tired. Then I saw it. 4 trees not far from the old one where we had sat had fresh wounds along their trunks. Bark stripped away in long vertical scars, pale wood exposed beneath. One trunk leaned unnaturally, splintered where it met the roots, as if something had rammed it once hard enough to damage, not enough to topple. No saw marks, no chain cuts, just deliberate harm. It was not enough to erase evidence. It was enough to send a message. Caleb stepped forward, laid his palm against one of the stripped trunks. His fingers spread slowly over the raw surface. We can grow this again, he said, just like we can grow us. His voice was steady, not hopeful exactly, but certain in a way I had not heard from him before. I looked at his hand on the tree and felt something settle into place that had been loose for years. My mother had kept the truth of this land buried in a metal box under a tree inside a life she tried to hold together with Sunz. She had not given me a mystery just to haunt me. She had given me a way out of the pattern that had shaped the men in our family, the quiet that turned into distance, the secrets that grew into walls. I reached out and rested my hand beside Caleb's on the rough wood. The scar on the trunk ran under both our palms, a raised line we could feel but not erase. The orchard was wounded. The family was too. But for the first time, the damage did not feel like an ending. It felt like a place to begin speaking. The last of the daylight slipped across the orchard as Caleb and I spread the documents out over the kitchen table. The papers looked almost fragile under the warm overhead light, like old truths uneasy about being uncovered. We moved around each other with a quiet coordination that felt surprising, as if some part of us had always known how to work together but had never been given the chance. Caleb sorted through the letters while I reviewed the surveys, marking the pages we needed for the hearing. Every so often our hands reached for the same folder, and we would pause, then shift, a small shared smile breaking the tension. It was the closest we had come to easy companionship in years. The printer jammed and I stepped outside for a walk to clear my head before trying again. The evening air was sharp, smelling faintly of cold earth and distant wood smoke. Down the hill, Main Street glowed through the branches. I headed toward town, my breath rising in clouds as I walked. When I reached the convenience store to pick up more paper, I stopped short. Across the lot near the trucks parked along the curb, Caleb stood speaking to a man in a dark coat. It took only a moment to recognize Hale even from behind. His posture was unmistakable, that easy authority that came from decades of winning rooms before he even said a word. They spoke quietly, not confrontational, but guarded. Hale stood too close, as if measuring the space around Caleb. I stayed where I was. I wanted to intervene, but something told me to wait, to see whether my son could hold his own. Caleb said something. Hale tilted his head, the faintest smile creeping at the edge of his mouth. Then he leaned in a fraction more, the way a man might lean toward an open weakness. Whatever words he offered seemed to bind the air between them for a moment. Then Caleb stepped back. His shoulders lifted and he met Hale's gaze with a steadiness I had not seen since he was a boy, trying to pretend he was not hurt by anything I did or failed to do. "You do not get to define my family." I could not hear him from where I stood, but the sentence was clear in the movement of his mouth and the firmness of his stance. Hale gave a small nod, as if absorbing information he had not expected. Then he walked away toward the side street, coat brushing against his legs. Caleb saw me when he turned. He walked over with his hands deep in his pockets. His breath came out uneven, not from cold, but from holding back whatever he had wanted to say earlier. "He started in on you," he said, "about how you leave things when they get heavy." I waited. There was no defense that would not sound rehearsed. "And what did you tell him?" I asked. Caleb looked down at the asphalt. "I told him he does not get to decide who we are. Not anymore." We drove home in a silence that felt fuller than words. The town lights slipped behind us, leaving only the soft glow of the road and the long stretch of woods framing both sides. When we reached the house, the orchard stood dark and still, the damaged trees listing like tired sentries. Inside, Harris was waiting at the table with a fresh stack of notes. He walked us through the play for the morning. What to expect, what to avoid, the kind of questions Hale might try to use to shake us. His calm made it feel almost manageable. After he left, the house seemed to settle into a hush. Caleb reorganized the documents one last time, humming under his breath, something I had not heard him do since he was small. When the clock nudged past 10, he stretched and said he needed air. I nodded and watched him disappear through the back door. My phone buzzed, a number I did not know. I hesitated before answering. A soft voice on the other end asked if I was Jack. Then she gave her name, Ellen Price, Henry Marston's former secretary. She said she had been holding on to documents Henry asked her to keep, originals he did not trust to leave in the office. She told me she had seen the notice about the hearing in the local paper and believed the time had come to pass them on. She lived in a small complex near the edge of town. When she opened the door, I saw a woman whose years had worn gently across her face. She invited me to sit and slid a stack of folders across the coffee table with careful hands. Henry was a man full of regrets, she said. But he wanted to make one thing right before he died. He trusted your mother. And he trusted that someday someone in your family would understand why this mattered. Her apartment was small and warm, filled with houseplants and the faint smell of lavender. She spoke of Henry with the softness of someone who had known a complicated man and cared for him anyway. The folders she gave me were heavy with decades of history. Copies of deeds, surveyor notes, letters he had written to the county explaining the boundary lines, all of it intact. I thanked her, though the word felt too small. She walked me to the door and rested her hand briefly on my arm. "Make sure the land stays with the person it was meant for," she said. The drive home was darker than before. Clouds had drifted in, covering the stars, and the air held a quiet that felt almost expectant. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was lit only in the kitchen. Caleb was not inside. I found him standing at the edge of the orchard, hands in the pockets of his jacket, shoulders drawn close. He turned when he heard me step into the yard. "You were gone a while," he said. I held up the folders. "Someone Henry trusted had something for us," I said. He nodded and looked out over the orchard again. The broken trunks stood in loose silhouettes, their shapes softened by the dark. He did not speak, and I let the silence stay. It was the kind of silence that does not close a door but waits for one to open. I walked past him and sat under the old apple tree. The ground felt colder than before the frost, settling into the soil. I leaned back against the rough bark and closed my eyes. The wind moved through the orchard with a low whisper. Somewhere in that sound I felt my mother's presence. Not as a ghost hovering at the edge of vision, but as a patience I recognized, the same patience she had carried through a life of quiet battles and moments she never explained. Caleb sat down beside me. He held a mug of coffee, steam lifting into the cold. "I thought you might need this," he said. I wrapped my hands around it. The heat seeped through my fingers into the places I had kept cold for too long. "You do not have to be strong alone anymore," he said. The way he said it did not demand anything of me. It simply named the truth I had been circling since the moment he came back home. We sat together, our breath drifting into the night. The orchard stood around us, wounded but still standing. Tomorrow the hearing would decide what belonged on paper. But sitting there under the tree, feeling the weight of the mug and the steadiness of my son beside me, I understood the real decision was mine alone. The morning would ask me to choose what kind of man I was willing to become now that running was no longer who I wanted to be. The morning rose slowly over Maple Harbor, the light muted and pale as if the sky itself were taking a quiet breath before the day began. I stood at the kitchen sink, hands braced on the counter, listening to Caleb moving around behind me. He shifted papers, checked lists, tried to pretend he wasn't watching me. There was something steady in his presence now, something that made the silence feel full instead of hollow. We drove toward town with the cold air sliding through a crack in the window. Neither of us spoke much. The road rolled out in front of us, bare trees lining both sides like witnesses waiting for the moment to come. When the courthouse appeared at the end of Harbor Street, its brick walls catching the first touch of sun, I felt a ripple of nerves move through me. Not sharp, just enough to remind me of the weight of what we were carrying. Inside the hearing room was smaller than I imagined, the kind of space where voices softened out of respect rather than fear. Haley sat at the far table, his posture perfect. His papers arranged in crisp symmetry. He glanced at us once and lowered his eyes again as if the distance between us no longer belonged to him to command. Harris gave me a small nod from his seat near the wall. The kind of nod a man gives when he knows this moment belongs to someone else. The board entered and sat down. The rustle of their coats sounded louder than it should have. Hale began speaking with that steady, confident tone he carried like a badge. He laid out his case map after map, his voice smooth as polished stone. The boundary lines he presented were narrow, convenient trim to fit Westbrook's ambitions. There was no tremor in him, no sign of doubt. He looked like a man who believed the ground would always shift to his step. Then it was my turn. I felt the weight of the old documents in my hands, the 1979 survey, Henry's deed, my mother's handwritten notes. I placed them on the table with a calmness I didn't expect. The board leaned in, their faces tightening with focus. Harris spoke to the legal inconsistencies. I added the silent pieces of the story, the ones written in worn ink and careful handwriting. I finished with the internal emails from the anonymous employee, proof of a pattern, not an accident. For a moment, the room stilled. One board member asked a question, sharp but fair. Another leaned back, studying the maps, cross-checking the lines. It wasn't quick. It wasn't simple. They took their time, as if they understood this wasn't just paperwork, but a legacy laid bare. When they returned, the chairwoman read the decision with a clear and measured voice. The forced sale attempt was dismissed. Further investigation would begin immediately. Hale was placed on administrative leave until the inquiry was complete. He didn't argue. He simply gathered his papers, his face unreadable. As he turned to leave, he glanced toward me. Not with challenge, not with defeat, but with something quieter. A man watching a door close on a version of his life he had believed would always open for him. Caleb rose beside me. He looked toward the board, then toward the orchard only he could see in his mind. This is my grandmother's home, and it is where my father is learning to become the man he always wanted to be. His voice didn't break. It didn't push. It simply landed with the kind of truth that settles deeply into a room. A few heads lowered. Harris gave a small smile. I felt something in my chest loosen, a place that had been locked for far too long. We drove home with the windows cracked, letting the cool air sweep through the truck. The orchard came into view as we rounded the bend, its broken trees standing in quiet dignity. Caleb carried the small burlap sack of seeds, the ones my mother had kept for decades. We walked into the orchard without speaking. The soil felt cold but open, as if it knew what we were about to do. Caleb knelt first. He dug a small hollow near the base of the old tree and rested the first seed inside. His hand hovered a moment before brushing the soil back over it. Not hurried, not unsure, just gentle. I watched him, the boy who had once looked at me with hurt. I could barely face now, sinking into the earth with a steadiness that felt like forgiveness in motion. I joined him beside the next mound. We worked slowly, seed by seed, the earth cool against our fingers. The afternoon light shifted into a warm amber that softened the bare branches overhead. At one point, Caleb's hand brushed mine as we reached for the same spot of soil. He didn't pull away. For a long time, neither did I. We stood when the last seed was planted. The orchard felt different now, not healed, not new, but beginning. I placed my hand on the bark of the old tree, feeling its rough strength beneath my palm. Caleb stepped close enough that I could feel the warmth of his shoulder near mine. My mother had left me land, but the land was only the shell of the gift. She had left me a chance to turn toward what mattered, to break the silence that had passed from one generation to the next, to meet my son in the open air with nothing between us but the truth. A soft wind moved through the orchard, lifting a few leaves in a slow spiral. The mounds of fresh soil caught the late sunlight, glowing faintly as if holding their own quiet promise. Caleb looked across the field with a small, thoughtful smile. "They will grow," he said. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into me. "So will we." Evening drifted in the sky, deepening into soft blue. The light faded, but the new soil held its warmth, and the orchard stood waiting in its quiet rebirth. As I walked back toward the house beside my son, I felt the world tilt gently toward a new beginning, one planted not in certainty, but in hope. And in that fading light, I understood that the inheritance my mother left was not land at all. It was the road back to a life I had almost forgotten how to live.